I did not expect to need that many attempts to get through this video, but I made way too many mistakes throughout it, and since this video will be quite long, they could still happen here, but I will try to make my best not to stumble over my own tongue just too often. But now I think I'm finally ready for the flagship comparison for the first half of 2017, and same as the one as I did for the $300 phones, it will be quite long, but I plan to make a few changes for you to get your information a little bit more directly, so you can better judge which phone is the best one. But since I'm talking about best one, the margin of all these phones, the difference between those is so small because all of them are legit flagships. So when I say one is weaker than the other, it doesn't mean much, and it definitely isn't always a deciding factor. It's just something, a small decision, but I want to try to give you the best possible amount of information so you know which is more important for you, and then you can decide for your own. And before a few of you start asking, why did you include these phones but maybe not this or this? The reason is, I think these are the most recent flagship that I've reviewed, that are the most popular ones that I get most asked about to review and compare and so on, and this is why I've included them. I also maybe don't have access to all of them, and maybe later on I will make another video like this, but as for right now, the four competitors would be, first of all, the Samsung Galaxy S8. That has to be in this comparison. After all, this is the flagship of 2017 for most people, just in average. Then, of course, the G6 just had to be in here there. And then, for example, one surprise already could be the Huawei P10 Plus. And why not the P10? The reason is I just didn't have the P10 on hand. I could have gotten it, but I also thought, if I would compare all the flagships with each other, I should take the very best of each brand. And this is still so close in terms of size that it is, after all, the best P10. And that's why this one is included. Now, the next one could also maybe be a little bit of a weirdness or an oddity, anomaly. That's the Xiaomi Mi6. But the reason, therefore, is just because it has to be imported. So that one is not like available everywhere. But something like the P10 Plus is also not maybe available everywhere. But because I have a viewership everywhere, this is available. After all, if you import it, you have to go through an import shop usually though, and it is cheaper. But I'm not gonna include that. But after all, it is a legit flagship, so it had to be in here there. But talking already about shops and so on, a quick shout out to Cyberport for the S8, for the P10 Plus, and for the G6. And a huge shout out to CECT shop for the Mi6, because without those two shops, this comparison wouldn't have been possible. But otherwise, I would say let's already get to the first category, which will be design. And this time I will always name the first place at first and the other ones behind it, because the other way it was a little bit different. It was the other way around, which was maybe a little bit more confusing. Of course, it will be very subjective, but I will try to give you, at least in the detailed part, the most objective, a little bit objective part. I have to just include a little bit something of that, and later on we will see. Okay, let's start off with the four phones here and with the design. So just about the design, just in terms of that, my first place goes to the Mi6. Why? Because maybe even though it's a little bit wider than, for example, something like the S8, it just feels, due to being very thin and with nice curves, and the glass metal, the glass back just feels so great. Also, the metal frame here is quite grippy, and you can reach that one so easily. I also think the fingerprint reader is placed great, same as the buttons, and everything else seems so smooth, and it just has the best in-hand feel and also a very premium solid feel, and this is what is very important for me. Of course, for a lot of people that is not important, but this just has the best in-hand feel of all these phones, so that's why it's the first place. Now the second place goes to the P10 Plus. The reason therefore is, first of all, the very amazing build quality. It feels super sturdy, buttons click so good as no other phone, and they are placed absolutely right, with the fingerprint reader placed right, of course, also here with a little bit of some almost curve, at least it feels a little bit like it. The only thing that I would complain here about is maybe the lack of oleophobic coating, but this by now should have been actually fixed, but the rest just seems fine. And for a 5.5 incher, this also actually feels very compact. Now, the third place goes to the Samsung Galaxy S8, and even though it's maybe the most narrow one and should be kind of the best possible one to use with one hand due to having this 18.5:9 aspect ratio, it's also a little bit top heavy and actually a little bit unwieldy. It's also a little bit harder to hold on to because it's just mostly glass and you can't really grip the frame always so great. So also then maybe some things like the distortion on the side here with the reflections, and overall it absolutely feels great, even though maybe the back feels a little bit hollow, but I complained about that already in my review. It just doesn't quite feel as a, like let's say $800 or even $700 or $600 phone. It could have made it a little bit more premium in my opinion, because something like the Mi6 just feels way more substantial. This almost feels too lightweight and not balanced properly. But still, like I said, the differences here are very small and very subjective. And I guess subjective is the best reason why this phone is only the 4th place, because I know a ton of people will disagree with me, but the problem for me is just that this device gets wider towards the back and has some weird angles. And I just think it doesn't feel comfortable in the hand. If they would have just used the angles the other way around like this, it would have felt actually way better. Of course, it also feels a little bit hollow. I know a lot of people complained about that fact, that I've complained about that as well already, but the fingerprint reader is placed nicely, the buttons are okay. I'm not a fan of the buttons actually on the left, because for games it's quite weird because I always kinda hit them. But overall, it's very nicely built, and especially for a lot of people who always say water resistance is very important, then the S8 and the G6 could be way more higher up on top on this list. But I think for the normal average user, and especially someone like me, it is not that important. Because if, for example, also military grade specs are important for you, like the G6 has, these two could be on top, but for me it's the in-hand feel. It has to feel premium, everything has to be conveniently placed, and that's why the rating is like it is. But the next category would be best fingerprint reader. First place here goes to the P10, because as you can see here, this one is so reliable, I think absolutely nicely placed, and it has the fastest screen turn-on time that I've seen, so definitely easy win here. The Mi6 gets the 2nd place because it's also conveniently placed, at least for me. I know a lot of people either like it on the back or front, but I like it on the front. And this one is super reliable, and the screen on turn-on time is maybe a little bit slower than on the P10, but still very fast, so I like that. The 3rd place goes to the G6 because it's still, for a back-mounted one, placed absolutely conveniently. The only thing is that it is very reliable, but as you can see, the screen turn-on time is just a little bit on the slower side. That's a little bit of a bummer. But of course, the 4th place goes here for the fingerprint reader, just because of its location to the S8, because it's maybe not the very best one, and it would be a little bit faster in terms of screen turn-on time than the G6, but due to the odd location, I'm just not the biggest fan of it. And I know a lot of people now could say, but it has iris scanner, face detection, and so on. Yes, if you want to use that, it's okay, but I still think it's not nearly as convenient, and I think most people would just prefer a well-placed and well-working fingerprint reader. Otherwise, let's talk about the displays here. Now, just in terms of brightness, the first place would go to the Mi6 with 675 lux, then to the S8 with 645 lux, then the P10 with 560 lux, and then the G6 with 505 lux. Now, I know a lot of people now will say, but the S8 and the G6 with auto mode in sunlight get brighter. Yes, but I did not include that in the testing, because that's not something, especially the G6 can hold up all the time, and in normal situation, that's just like it is. But you could disagree with me, absolutely no problem. Now, in terms of display quality though, let's turn them on so we can actually see them and compare them, so I can talk a little bit about them. And actually, this position was almost already right, because the rating is just like this, and I will get to in just a few seconds. Of course, that's always very subjective, especially if you are a fan of AMOLED panels. Then of course it's easily, without a doubt, the high quality display of the S8. But okay, here's my rating. First and kind of 2nd place together goes to the Mi6 and to the S8, because the reason is, of course, yes, the S8, I mean, the Mi6 is the only one with just a 1080p display, but it is so well calibrated and with so good quality. That's the reason, because not a whole lot of motion blur, almost non-existent. Very bright, absolute stable viewing angles. Colors are, in my opinion, quite natural, which is very important. But if you want, of course, more saturation and so on, the S8, due to also having amazing blacks, of course, due to AMOLED, super viewing angles and so on, a high quality display for sure. It's only the calibration why it's not the clear first place, because I think adaptive display, after using the S7 for 1 year, is just a little bit too much. Especially videos in the darker situations just lose a little bit details, and it is a little bit too heavy. I know there is a cinema and the basic mode which are more accurate, but those in my opinion are way too warm. And the only mode where I have brightness or warmth control or color temperature control is the adaptive mode, which already has a good one. So if the basic mode would have color temperature control, it could have been a little bit different, but especially for some people who maybe don't like the burn-in so much, it could be preferred by them. But that's why I will give these one, because they are both pretty much the very best for their own categories. Now, the G6, if I'm not wrong, let me quickly check that, is the 3rd place, yes. And the reason therefore is the following. It has the best blacks for a non-AMOLED display, because almost no IPS glow at all. But the only reason why it's maybe not a little bit closer towards here is that I think colors, as you can maybe see, are just a tad too pale. I would wish for a little bit more saturation after all, because a lot of people also here disagreed with me. But if I see all those phones here side by side, of course they are all calibrated a little bit different. The colors in normal experience just felt a tad too pale to me, and you can't really adjust that. But the reason why the P10 Plus, even though it has actually the better calibration than the G6, is the fourth place, is the following. And I will get to that in just a second. Just so I didn't really show you many pictures, but you can of course check the review. But as you can see, great calibration here on the Mi6, very nice and impressive, and quite similar here, but this is just better. But the main reason why I will give this the last place, and this is just something that annoys me in normal use, is the motion blur. It just has way too much motion blur, and this is quite annoying because the refresh rate of the AMOLED display and on, for example, the Mi6 are just way better, and the Mi6 would be, the G6 would be definitely on that level as well, because there is not nearly as much motion blur here. And here it's, I would say, like on the Mi6, but the Mi6 has the better calibration, but I just can't get over the fact of how much motion blur this is. And in normal use, it's not always important of which screen is really the best one, but if you scroll a lot, which I think a lot of people do, this is something that kind of annoys me a little bit over time. So next category would be the speaker. First of all, just quickly, which one is the loudest one? The loudest one would be the S8, then the P10 Plus. Not all that far behind would be the G6 and then the Mi6. But of course, volume is not everything. So what about the actual qualities? And I will give you the demo right now so we can check which one would be the best. And I will give the first place quite easily to the P10 Plus, and I will get to why in just a few seconds. Okay, the first place, why? Because first of all, it also has this speaker arrangement with the highs from the earpiece and the other one, the bass and the mids from the downside, and therefore you have some little bit of stereo sound on front-facing sound, and it's also very loud, very high quality, and very warm. So definitely a very well balanced, really great sound. Now the second place is kind of a tie, but it really comes down to what you prefer, because the G6 and the Mi6 would be those two, and let me quickly get into why after the demo. Sorry. Okay, between these two, it comes more down to personal preference, because the G6 is a little bit louder and also sounds quite clear, quite high quality. The Mi6 though sounds a little bit nicer since it has some front-facing sound also with the earpiece for the highs and the bottom firing speaker for the mids and bass, and therefore it sounds a little bit more towards you, but it just doesn't have quite the volume. But in terms of sound, they're actually very similar, so that's why you should choose which one you want. If you want maybe a little bit more volume or a little bit more front facing, then the Mi6. For more volume, of course, the G6. Now, what about the S8? Now the reason, even though it's the loudest one, it gets the last place is just because it's by far the most tinny one. It's not extremely thinny or something like that, and it still sounds decent, especially if you just watch YouTube movies and so on, it's okay. But it just doesn't have the clarity of the other ones. It just sounds not really muffled, but just all a little bit weirdly tinny, but still totally fine. Like I said, the differences here are not usually big, but here it's noticeable, just it sounds just a little bit off, but still good. Now, headphone quality would be the next. I know the first place actually doesn't have a headphone jack, it has an adapter, would be the Mi6, because very loud, and you have some extra options in the settings to also adjust it with some headphones on. It sounds really great. Now, why the G6 only gets the second place is, I think, because I have the... no, it actually doesn't have, sorry, I made that issue already the first time. Because the G6 would have been higher on top. It would have been maybe the first or at least second place if it would have been the version with the extra DAC. But most people don't have access to that, and I also have only the normal DAC version, and that one sounds not that. But the second place goes to the S8 because it is a little bit louder. We have some extra options with the equalizer and so on, some audio adjustments, and it just sounds a tad little better. But here the difference to the G6 is very, very close. And if you don't need the extra options like equalizer and so on, if you do that with an own app, almost on par. Just not quite as loud and maybe though a little bit more higher quality. So if you want a little bit more volume, then the S8. If you want maybe a little bit of the actual better sound, then the G6. But easily the fourth place goes to the P10 Plus, because I don't think any Huawei phone so far has impressed me in terms of sound. They all are just about average, just about okay. So if you want a good experience, you should maybe not go for this one, but at least easily go for one of the other ones. Now, performance. The first place goes here to the only proper 2017 flagships with a 2017 chipset, because I'm talking about the S8 here and the Mi6. Those are both on the same place because I can't really quite judge which one is best. I know personally for me, but you have to tell on your own, because for example here, the scrolling of the S8 is super buttery smooth in most situations. Sometimes there is this little bit of some jitteriness, some small little stutters, like nano stutters. And this is something that a lot of people over a longer period of time just don't like so much on the S8. But you get a very great, still quite good multitasking experience, and also this is all fine. So maybe not quite as good as on the 6 GB of the Mi 6, but it just feels a tad lighter and a tad little bit smooth. But it's really, this is super close. And if you don't really mind or never did mind the slightly little bit jitteriness of the S8, it's the first place. But why the Mi 6 is also on the first place? Because it has 6 GB of RAM, so the multitasking is actually a little bit more powerful, but access to it is a little bit weirder due to a little bit longer animation here. But otherwise, it is super smooth. It just doesn't have the the AMOLED smoothness, but therefore it's way more consistent, because I see a little bit less lag. I don't see any jitteriness at all. Everything is super performant at all times. And as you can see here, everything just works all the time. So absolutely top in that regard. Now the third place goes to the G6. The reason is just because it also behaves very good, and the difference to something like an S8 or Mi 6 in normal use wouldn't be really noticeable. You really have to use both of or all three of them a long time, especially also side by side, to notice the differences. It just sometimes doesn't feel quite as smooth, not maybe quite as snappy, not quite as powerful in terms of multitasking compared to the Mi 6, for example, but still super. They did an absolutely great job in optimization wise. And yes, I know all of the Huawei fans now will say, but that can't be the Kirin in terms of benchmarks, is by far the best one. The problem is maybe this device actually is very fast, and the multitasking also here with the 6 GB RAM version is quite good. But I also have to say, what Huawei does in terms of RAM optimization is not all that great. It's maybe like on a Samsung level, so not all that great. But as you can already see, what it does though is just have this slower scrolling. It feels kind of like artificially limited, and that's why it just doesn't feel as lightweight. And this is what I mean. This is more of a subjective thing, more a perceived thing, because it is very smooth and it is pretty much completely lag free. But it has noticeably less of a smoothness, more of a lighter feel. It just stutters maybe sometimes a little bit more, and just never feels as smooth due to the slow motion blur and so on. This is just a little bit annoying, and that's why I can't really give it more than the fourth place, because yes, on paper the chip is absolutely top, but you don't really feel that all that much. And now gaming performance, just real quick, let me quickly check that. First place goes to the S8. The GPU is really a powerhouse, because even on its fullest resolution it really delivers full, and if you maybe go down to 1080p it's even better. Then pretty much on par almost is the Mi 6, also very well. They should optimize maybe a little bit more, but still great. Then the P10 Plus, because that one is actually really good for gaming, absolutely no problem. And then a little bit weirder, because it was actually a little bit weaker than some other Snapdragon 821 phones, is the G6, because I've seen a little bit more issues here. Now, the next thing would be battery charge times. The S8, if I'm not wrong, needs 1.5 hours. I think Mi 6 was a tad little faster, and the G6. So all of these are within 5 minutes. That could be just measurement issues and so on. So these are very good. The P10 Plus needs a little bit longer. But now about the battery life. And I will mostly just talk about, that's okay. Let's cover mobile data and Wi-Fi. The Xiaomi Mi 6 gets everywhere from about 6 to 7 hours on mobile data. I would say 6.5 should be expected. So very good. Now, on Wi-Fi, though, maybe even 9 hours or more. So absolutely easily the first place. The second place then goes to the G6, because that one also gets like 5 to 5.5 hours. So maybe an hour less on mobile data. but still very good also, like maybe not all that much more on Wi-Fi, like maybe an hour more or maybe a little bit more than that, but still easily the next place. Then the P10 Plus, which has an actually very good standby drain on mobile data, but not so much on Wi-Fi, and that's why it's just a third place. It could maybe be a little bit better because it also gets like 5 hours on screen time, but it could get even more so. But on Wi-Fi, the issue is maybe get just 4 to 6 hours because the standby drain for me right now still, since EMUI, is quite bad because I have like sometimes 2, sometimes even 3% per hour of standby drain on Wi-Fi, which I don't have on mobile data, because then it could get closer to the G6, but let's say 5 hours on mobile data. The problem with the S8Y, it's just a 4th place, even though it has a really good battery life on Wi-Fi for me, which, like for example 7, maybe even a little bit more hours is great, but just about 3.5 to 4 hours on mobile data. Now, I know a lot of people say this has a lot to do with your use, which is though the same between all devices, but also the reception that you have. But the problem is it's only Samsung phones that I have this issue with the standby drain on mobile data. Because on the S7 it was the case, on the S6, on the A5 and so on. And here even more so noticeable, it's also always warm all the time. And even though my reception is fine, my connection is very good where I tested all of these, this one just is an anomaly, just quietly fails out in this regard. Okay, software. First place goes to the S8, and yes, I know that's a little bit of a surprise for many, because if you don't include all the bloat, if you don't include the maybe jitteriness, and if you don't include maybe some other things like that it could get worse in terms of performance over time, then maybe not. But I see just all the features because we have a very great theming engine. We have all these nice little small things like, for example, the swipe with the palm to make a screenshot. You have one-handed mode. You have pretty much the most amount of features. You have so much that I don't really even want to talk about it, and that's why I like it so much. Sure, I would like to slim it down a little bit to not have this jank over time, but still, just in terms of software, it's the first place. Now, the second place goes to also a little bit of a surprise, maybe the Xiaomi Mi 6, because this is not at the default launch. It doesn't matter because the launcher doesn't matter. But you also have, as you can see, a very nice theming engine. I'm using a different theme here just because I prefer it, and I know a lot of people always want to see the default theme in such a comparison, but yeah, it is what it is. But you also get a lot of smaller features here, like for example, here you have the battery that you can see in percentages, which you still don't see, for example, quite as nice on Google phones, but you have also dual instances, you have the option to turn off the light, so also a lot of small features, but really nice ones. But the problem is, I have to point that out, you need the proper version for, because the Chinese version still doesn't work so far. I have a shop ROM here from CCT, but that one, even though it's actually even German and so on, and it's not an official ROM because it has some actual changes, works just fine because this is running 8.2.0.2, which is not an official version. But everything works here. Google services, Gmail, Chrome, everything, notifications. And the way it works, it just works. But a global ROM just came out, I think 2 days ago, and it seems to work just fine, so just to cover that. Now, the third place in terms of software would go to the G6. The only thing why it's not a little bit higher on top is we still don't have a proper theming engine. And I think this design, even though it looks quite nice, could be a little bit nicer. Also in terms of features, it is quite solidly packed because you get the most amount of features that you usually need. And I can't really complain, but it's a little bit of a, yeah, it feels a little bit left behind a little bit after a while, but still, it's a totally solid software. Now, the last place for me definitely goes to the P10 Plus for a few reasons. First of all, the screen dimming is still an issue. As you can see here, now the display dims, and without it dims. Still an issue, still not fixed. I don't get why they don't finally fix that. It's not a problem for me because I have a workaround, but still. Then there is the RAM management, is a little bit on the harder side. Also, the Wi-Fi standby drain has to be fixed, and some other minor things. So the software is just not quite polished. It also feels a little bit inconsistent in a few ways. So that's about that. Now, in terms of camera, what I did the last time, I actually showed a lot of pictures, but that would have just blown this video out of proportion. So I will just give you all the ratings and then not really show anything. Sorry for that. You could just watch the specific reviews, but it would have been just too much, and I just don't have the time. So sorry for that. Now, for selfies, the first place is the P10 Plus, then the S8, followed by the Mi 6, and then the G6. Why? The P10 Plus, really sharp, detailed, quite nice high dynamic range and so on. So really top notch front-facing camera with an autofocus. Also autofocus, but not quite as reliable on the S8, but it also delivers really nice pictures and so on. And actually very close in some aspects, even maybe sometimes better, but without the autofocus and so on, goes to the Mi 6. But the G6 actually is noticeably behind because the selfie cam of this phone is not all that great. Now, low light quality is quite an easy win for the S8 because what it manages to get in terms of light and so on in low light is absolutely great. Then the G6, not that far off, but still noticeably, and then the P10 Plus and the Mi 6. The differences why these one are on the same place, but not the different. The P10 Plus maybe sometimes is a little bit better, but the autofocus isn't all that good, and the shutter times are a little bit slower. This one a little bit almost not noticeable inferior in terms of quality, but faster shutter times and better autofocus. Now the main cam. I give the first place to the G6. Why? First of all, the wide angle lens is great. The quality, especially for landscape footage, is absolutely amazing, and even details and so on. Yes, maybe the autofocus maybe isn't always perfect, but you can get amazing, absolutely staggering, if that's the right term, results. The next one then would be the P10 Plus, which I called maybe most probably the best camera. But if I compared it side by side, the landscape footage was just not quite as good. The autofocus was not perfect, but it has the higher dynamic range and it can produce a little bit nicer photos, especially if you use the extra features like, for example, the portrait mode where you can blur out things and so on, and you have a little bit more flexibility in the manual mode, but otherwise really top. Then the S8, and it still delivers. It's maybe not a leap and bounds better camera compared to the S7, some would even say worse, but very close. And it's still, why I like it so much is because the shutter lag is pretty much non-existent. The autofocus is by far the best, so I get the highest amount of proper pictures. On the other ones, I sometimes still get a picture that is out of focus, not blurred out or something like that. And here it's very consistent and still delivers pictures on a really great level. Now the Mi 6 falls a little bit behind here. First of all, the dual cam is not really a feature, only use the main cam because only that one has the proper quality. It's not that far off, but they should still optimize a few things, but you can still get almost great pictures out of it, and I still definitely enjoy it. It's still absolutely easily good enough. Video cam. Now here an easy first place to the S8 because what it does in terms of autofocus and with a nice optical and image stabilization with a software one with super nice amount of details, very high bitrate and a little bit of artifacting and so on. So top notch when it comes to video, but also actually not quite far behind is the G6. The only reason why it's not quite as close, even though it's also super qualities, great bitrate, exposure and so on, all different bugs, but it's the autofocus. It's just not quite as good as on the S8. Now, the third place and fourth place together, once again a tie, Mi 6 and P10 Plus, because I was never a big fan of the camera or the video cam of a Huawei phone, because they still have to make some improvements, because even though it has the slightly better video quality on its own compared to the Mi 6, it's the autofocus that is just way too abrupt, way too jumpy, just not quite as solid, not quite as subtle. This is where the Mi 6 makes, in my opinion, a better job. It's just not quite as detailed, not quite as sharp as the P10, but that would have been it. The video is about at 28 minutes, so let's quickly get the ratings for everyone who didn't want to watch the whole part. Just quickly. Design, first place, Mi 6. Just feels incredible, feels amazing. While P10 Plus feels quite compact for a 5.5 incher, amazing build quality, everything's placed right top. Then the S8, super narrow, feels quite good, maybe not quite as premium, and it has a few more drawbacks, but otherwise it's still a very nice phone. The G6 is on the last place, and pretty much mostly just because it feels a little bit unwieldy, a little bit more bulky, and just not as comfortable as the other ones. Now, the best fingerprint reader, I've said that already, P10 Plus. Then Mi 6, G6 and S8, and the S8 mostly because of the bad location. Now display, I gave a tie for the first place to the Mi 6 and to the S8. The S8 has an absolutely impressive display, but just not properly naturally calibrated. Here the Mi 6 makes a better job, and even though it has a little bit more IPS glow than some other better phones here, the calibration is really nice and the otherwise qualities are very high, even though it doesn't have the highest amount of, or the highest resolution, but it doesn't really matter. Then the G6, amazing blacks, but it feels a little bit too pale for me in comparison to the other ones, just a little bit too flat. The P10 Plus has the better calibration, but loses out because of just way too much motion blur. Now speakers, The loudest one, S8, then P10 Plus, then G6, and then Mi6. But in terms of quality, first place goes quite easily to the P10 Plus because it has this kind of stereo arrangement and sounds way better than the rest, just more loud and in general, and higher quality. Then the Mi6, it's maybe not the loudest one, it's actually the lowest volume one, but it has also front-facing kind of with the dual arrangement, and it sounds still quite nice and quite good. Then the G6, actually on the same place with the Mi6 because it's a little bit louder, but just doesn't have the front-facing sound. And then the S8, even though it's the loudest, sounds the most tinny one. Headphone jack, Mi6, even though it doesn't have one, you need an adapter for that, but then it has the best sound. Then the S8, which is just a little bit in front of the G6, but the G6 would have maybe been actually the first place if I would have the version with the quad deck, but that's just not available here. And then actually noticeably apart the P10 Plus. Performance-wise, S8 and Mi6. The S8 maybe a little bit lighter, but therefore a little bit more jitteriness visible. The the Mi6, more consistent, but not quite as smooth due to not having an AMOLED display, but absolutely a top performer, but therefore also the better multitasking. Then the G6 just feels noticeably smoother and well optimized, not far behind, but still noticeable if you do it side by side compared to the other ones. But the last place, even though it should maybe due to the kind of better SoC, goes to the P10 Plus because the scrolling feels a little bit too heavy, it just doesn't feel as lightweight, and it's also way too much motion blur, but otherwise it would have been really good as well. Battery, Mi6, just about 1 hour more than the G6, which is the second place, which has like half an hour more than the P10 Plus, and then a little bit behind, especially on mobile data, with just 3.5 to 4 hours goes to the S8, which would have great battery life though on Wi-Fi, where it gets like 7 and more. Software, very subjective, comes down to what you want. Just in terms of features and what you get, it's for me the S8, even though it has a lot of bloat. Then the Mi6, because it has a lot of minor tweaks and adjustments that I just personally like with a great filming engine. Then the G6, solid software, a little bit featureless by now, not all that impressive, and it looks a little bit odd. But the P10 Plus gets the last place because too many bugs like screen dimming, way too much Wi-Fi drain, a few inconsistency with RAM management and so on. Otherwise, not bad. Cameras, just real quick. Selfies, P10 Plus, really top notch. Closely followed by the S8, then the Mi6, and then the G6, which is noticeably a little bit behind. Then low light, easily S8, not all that far behind the G6, and then the P10 Plus and Mi6 on the last place together, because the Mi6 has the better autofocus and faster shutter times, but the higher quality is a little bit towards the P10 Plus. Main camera, G6, first of all, amazing, especially for landscape footage, and it has the really amazing wide angle camera. Then closely followed by the P10 Plus, which sometimes can produce better pictures, but the autofocus and shutter times just aren't quite on that level, and it doesn't have the landscape is noticeably a little bit weaker compared to, I always say noticeably that a little bit, but you get what I mean. Then the S8, I think the experience is great because no shutter lag, great autofocus and everything else, but just in terms of the results, not quite on that level of the other two. And then the Mi6, a little bit behind, but it just isn't a proper flagship in the camera department. Video cam, S8, best video, just the smoothest one with the by far best exposure, stabilization, and also autofocus. The G6, just not with a that good autofocus, but otherwise still very, very close. The Mi6 and the P10 then are on the same place because the P10 Plus offers a little bit better quality, but the autofocus and some things are just not quite as good. So that's it for the summary. Now, let me quickly now summarize every phone on its own just to cover that and which one would be my personal rating. Mi6, because I think just the in-hand feel, the quality is just absolutely top-notch. We have a beautiful display. I really like it. It's very bright. The speakers are maybe not the loudest one, but sound very good. Headphone jack is great. Performance is pretty much the best one. The battery life is the best one. The software is top-notch. And the camera is maybe not quite on a level of the other three, but still very good. So that's kind of my personal favorite. Problem is now the other three ones. Why I'm not the biggest fan of the P10 Plus, I've already said it's the oleophobic coating. This could be fixed, but then there is still this little bit slower scrolling and the motion blur that just drags me down a little bit. If you don't care so much about that, you will get a well-performing device with a great display, the best speaker here in this arrangement, still good battery life. The software is something that they still have to work on because it still has way too many bugs, and you get a top-notch camera. So that's about that. The S8, I've said it already, it's still quite a great phone because it's top-notch display, quite a nice in-hand feel. The speaker is loud, even though it maybe doesn't sound all that great. Performance is top-notch. Battery life, at least on Wi-Fi, would be good, but not so much on mobile data. I like the software, and the camera experience overall is absolutely top, but it just has a few issues. Like, for example, it's a little bit harder to hold on. The aspect ratio isn't really a benefit, but also not a disadvantage. Unlock methods are not all that great. There are a few things that I just don't like so much, and it's very, very expensive. Now, the G6 actually would have been a really great phone. I would have liked it a lot more, I think, and I would have given it a better rating if it just wouldn't be for the awkward design. I think it feels just a little bit too edgy, a little bit too bulky, but otherwise, build quality is top-notch. The display, a little bit too pale. If they would have just made a little bit more properly saturated, it is noticeable, and I know people will disagree with me, but if you check all the other phones that I've had in the past, it is noticeable that this one just feels a little bit more flat and more pale. If that wouldn't have been the case, it would also been way better, because the speaker, just downfiring, but it sounds loud and it sounds quite good. The performance, not quite on the level of the first two, or I mean the S8 and the Mi 6, but it is noticeable, but otherwise still top-notch performer, absolutely no problems at all. Gaming was a little bit weaker. Battery life though, super once again, because there it's actually quite close to the very best ones in the flagship segment, actually one of the better ones. The software, a little bit boring, but it gets the job done, and the camera is also absolutely superb. So it really comes down to what you want, because I think, of course, for the mainstream one who wants a flashy phone that looks quite attractive and so on, that everyone will look at, it is the S8. For everyone who wants a more understated phone that not that many people know, with a great camera and so on, and if you like Huawei's approach, it is still a nice phone, but I think that kind of falls a little bit behind the competition. And I would say the G6 will be a great phone for a lot of people, especially an amazing alternative. If you don't have the issues like I do with the display and the design, then you will get an overall very high quality, great level quality, super solid device. Absolutely, without any doubts. And maybe I didn't give it quite the respect in my review that it should have gotten because of the subjective things, because I get those, but still. And like I said, the Mi 6 is just right for me. And this doesn't have to mean it's right for you because it's for me. Because for me, it feels just the best, which is important for me. It has a beautiful display, which is important for me. And all the other specs are exactly the way I need it to. And even though the camera falls maybe a little bit short overall to the rest, it's just not important for me. But it's price-wise the cheapest one. Because just in terms of value, it definitely wins, because it costs around $400 by now, where the rest is more closer towards $600-700. But I think you know all the categories, you know the placing right now, and that is something for you to judge. Like I said, you can't really go wrong with any one of those. It really comes down to what you want. If you want maybe a more sturdy device, if you want maybe a more polished device in some aspects, a better camera, better display. Everyone, if you just choose one specific point, is still solid enough in all the other categories, so you won't get disappointed. And I hope I gave you all this information. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. It would help me, and it would definitely motivate me more to make more of these longer but still very informative comparisons. So that would have been it. Comments down there below. And if you want to disagree with me and all that, absolutely fine, but please stay civil, and otherwise enjoy the weekend. Have a nice day.